Like a little intro.
Intro.
Okay, great. Okay, so we are joined by Robin Gray from 3 Acres and a Cow. He is a folk musician, social historian, writer, and land rights activist based in Sheffield. He's a sort of go-to guy for the land the land justice and ownership inside scoop for like Yorkshire. So it's really great to have him here. And he devised and performs a show called 3 Acres and a Cow that Cordelia mentioned already, that teaches people about England's radical history through folk songs. So I can hand it over to Robin.
Hey, can you hear me okay, Joe?
Yes, I can.
Great. Hi, welcome everybody. Lovely to see lots of your different pixels. As you can see, I've just dumped a metric fuck ton of links into the chat. Those are basically all the press articles and references that attach what I'm about to share with you. So how I'm structuring this is I'm just going to say a very short bit about me and the project I do, then I'm going to give you a little overview of Sheffield, starting in the rural areas, then going into the town centre, and then coming into the suburbs, which is where I'm based. Plenty of time for questions afterwards, so please do do get that going. And I'm going to share my screen so you don't need to see my face anymore. Let's go for that one over there. Wonderful. So as Joe said, I basically am a traveling musician, historian, land rights activist, and have been doing this now for nearly a decade. It's been very fun. We've got to a point now where we can go to pretty much anywhere in the country and perform to 100, 150 people. And it's what I do for a living, which is surreal and beautiful. Yeah, the show I do kind of covers 1,000 years of British radical history, teaching people about all the things that they don't teach us in school, because as many of you will know, the British Empire, what are the right words for it? I mean, did a lot of evil shit around the world, and it's funny that they don't tell us about that. But I think what's also really pertinent is before the British ruling classes exported their hideously oppressive models of ruling to other countries, they first perfected it on the people on this island. So that there's a photograph of my bum, and yeah, that's just to show I'm waving a slip around in the air and probably teaching people about the Norman conquest. As well as being a musician, historian, silly performer person, I also can do policy wonk when I need to. A few years ago, I got involved in writing the main land rights and land legislation policy document for our parliamentary opposition party. And yeah, some of the ideas of that have been nicked and are being, recycled as government policy. So yeah, I can talk shop and be a policy wonk as well as being an entertainer. So Sheffield, I moved to Sheffield 6 years ago from London because I couldn't afford to live in the south of England anymore. I got in ahead of the curve. There's been a massive migration north because generally in England, the further north you go or the further away from London you go, the cheaper it gets to live. But Sheffield is one of the only cities on this island that the architecture and the history of it is dominated by working class people, and in particular the steel and iron works. Sheffield is where all the cutlery used to be made, the knives used to be made, the scissors used to be made, and then eventually by the time that warfare started including lots of metal, it was also where a lot of the bombs were made and a lot of the guns were made. Right. So around the edge of Sheffield, like everywhere in this country, there are masses of huge aristocratic estates. This is my nearest aristocratic estate, and until recently it was the biggest privately owned building in Europe. And what most aristocratic families do. You know, we still very much have a large landowning aristocracy. We never had a revolution in this country and, you know, took their land off them. And we have one of the highest concentrations of land ownership on this island of anywhere in the world. What they tend to do now is they get rid of the houses because the houses are really expensive to run, but they keep all the land around them because they can make lots of money renting out that land or hosting shooting parties, and they get large amounts of farming subsidies, even if no farming's happening on the land, because that's how we roll in Europe, isn't it? So yeah, that is and you know, a lot of these aristocratic families, as well as owning large estates with huge amounts of land around the cities, they own the peri-urban land, and some of them also still have, you know, fairly sizable property portfolios, which include land in the centre of cities such as Sheffield. To the west of Sheffield, oh, that way on yours, we have the Peak District, which was our first national park in the 1950s and is absolutely fucking stunning. I hope you don't mind me swearing. It also has tons of reservoirs, which are absolutely beautiful. And I hope you get to visit it. And I hope you get to go and swim in one of those reservoirs, because if you're looking for a good time in Sheffield, going and swimming in one of those reservoirs on a sunny day is basically as good as it gets. And it's also illegal because everything fun is illegal in this country. As Cordelia already mentioned earlier, the reason why we have access to the Peak District was a result of people breaking the law by going on an illegal walk in the 1930s. But there's still much more illegal things to do in order to win more of our rights. So there's a lot of people who are doing sort of trespass swims at the moment, and there's a Facebook group called Sheffield Outdoor Plungers, which is absolutely like the A to Z of where to go and how to have a good time, and yeah, what to do if anybody tells you you're being naughty. So that is the private home of the Duke of Norfolk. Now, the Duke of Norfolk used to own all of Sheffield, like the whole thing. And he was the one who enclosed all of the land in Sheffield and said, you don't have common rights anymore. All this is now mine, 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 me. And like most aristocrats in the area, he never lived in Sheffield, but he turned a lot of his land into coal mines, because Sheffield at one point, was producing an absolutely massive amount of coal. So the aristocratic families didn't want to live in Sheffield because it was just too smelly and dirty. So that's a confusing thing about the British aristocracy. Like, he's called the Duke of Norfolk. He owned all of like South Yorkshire, but lives in a completely different part of the country and owns land. That's just kind of how they roll. And it actually traces back 1,000 years, because when William the Conqueror, a Viking who'd settled in northern France, moved to this country and invaded it and occupied it, he basically split the land up and gave it to his barons, but he gave them land in lots of different parcels in different places so that they would be harder for them to fight amongst each other. Anyway, blah, blah, blah. Duke of Norfolk, he's got quite a bit of money. No shit. This is a map of all the land that he still owns in Sheffield. You can see he doesn't own much in the city centre, and it's only a fraction of what he once owned. But that's because 100 years ago on this island, it looked very likely that landowners were about to be heavily taxed for their land when we first started having working people in the corridors of power. So the aristocracy sold off a lot of their inner city land 100 years ago. But what you will notice is he owns quite a lot on the east and northeast side, which is the poorer and more industrial area, and are places that are starting to be places that are interesting for being developed into housing or new places now. And where the sort of front line of that is this bit here, Attercliffe Waterside, was a patch of land that the council identified as somewhere there where they wanted to build some more social housing. Unfortunately, the Duke of Norfolk owns part of that site and wanted millions and millions of pounds off the council, was basically kind of blackmailing them, going like, look, not going to let you build there, not going to let you have your land unless you give me millions of pounds. And he shouldn't be compensated for it. It should just be taken back off him, because the way his ancestors treated the people of Sheffield was a fucking disgrace, if you excuse my language. If you get the chance, there used to be a massive army barracks on the edge of Sheffield that they built in the 1840s and 1850s because Sheffield was so likely to go into revolt. They built this massive army barracks, and it's been turned into a supermarket now. So literally you have like mass commercialization supermarkets still in like the full trappings of a military army barracks from nearly 100 years ago, which is something an architect, I'm sure you'll enjoy it. Literally the watchtowers are still there with the rifle holes. Right. Sheffield, also in the centre of town, used to have a massive ski village, of course, because why wouldn't it? And this became derelict back in the day. And I think I've got a derelict photo. There's the derelict photo. And developers have been fighting over this for years. People keep on being like, yes, we're going to do wonderful things here. And then they realize that they're probably not going to make loads of profit doing it. And then they stop. But why this is important is twofold. A, there's a lot of derelict and undeveloped land in the centre of Sheffield. And also, this used to be home to a travelling community. We have a significant lack of sites for travellers in this country, and they're one of the most marginalised and demonised communities on this island. And our ruling classes are very, very good at scapegoating them and making sure that whenever they're passing laws that mean they can be horrible to people, they're like, oh, we're doing it because of the travellers and the gypsies. And it's like, no, fuck off. You're doing it. You're going to use those laws on us, aren't you, as soon as you can? But, you know, demonising travellers and gypsies is a massive thing at the moment, still, sadly. And a few years ago, the ski village was cleared of all of the travellers and gypsies, so it could be redeveloped, which of course it hasn't been. But again, if you want a proper Mad Max post-apocalyptic experience, you can go up to the ski village and just walk around in it, and everybody's ripped down the fences, and it's batshit crazy. It really is. I'm talking very fast. I'm going to have a peaceful moment. Okay. So England is starting to become one of the international choices for people who want to launder their money and hide their ill-gotten gains from doing illegal, nasty shit all over the globe. We have a network of what used to be parts of our empire that are now called crown dependencies, and we just call them tax havens because they're basically places where people can start companies and avoid the law and avoid paying tax. That map is nearly 10 years out of date now, but you can see that around 5% of the centre of Sheffield, possibly as much as 10% if you work out the value, is owned in tax havens and secrecy jurisdictions. So places where, you know, it's impossible to find out the ownership, and if you buy and sell them, you can avoid paying any tax. That map is part of a private eye investigation by an incredible data scientist geek whiz called Anna Powell-Smith. When you go online, it all looks like it was somebody called Christian, but it really wasn't. It's just a lovely man taking advantage of a brilliant woman's hard labor. Gentrification! Yay! Architects! Yay! We've got gentrification here. Who'd have thunk it? I moved up from London 6 years ago. If I tried to move up from London now, I would not be able to afford to. It's like quite that simple. And I live as far away as you can be from gentrification and still live in Sheffield. Like, there is no sourdough anywhere near me. You cannot get a flat white. And I fucking love that because, anyway, one of the craziest things is the biggest area of gentrification at the moment is a place called Kelham Island, which is literally a floodplain in the centre of Sheffield, which is clearly going to be underwater in about 20, 30, 40 years' time. But, you know, why not build on floodplains? That's what we do in this country because we're stupid. Yeah, you know, there is a big problem with people land banking and developers sitting on land and communities not being able to build their own houses, and all the profits just disappearing up various people's noses in the corridors of power. I'm sure it's the same in most places, but yeah, it definitely is a thing in Sheffield. And, you know, we have the least amount of rent control in this country of nearly any country in Europe. Landlords can put the rent up as much as they want, whenever they want. They can evict people whenever they want. And literally people around me, their rents, like the landlords have just been like, meh, let's put up rent by 20%. Let's put it up by 50. You know, it's insane what landlords can get away with in this country. So I, as well as doing my performance-y Tory things, oh, we've got a microphone on. Who's that? Is that you, Joanna? Okay, great. I do walking tours, singing walking tours, and that's the map of the Sheffield one. As has already been mentioned, English councils still own huge amounts of public land, but they have been forced to sell a lot of it off in the last 10, 15 years because they're getting fiscally tortured by our right-wing national government. So there's a huge amount of public land being sold off. It shouldn't be being sold off. It's often sold off to the highest bidder rather than what being done with it, what's actually useful for communities. A problem we have in England is our right-wing government passed some laws that made it really easy to turn offices into residential, which sounds like a good idea, but they do it avoiding building regulations. So you get these nasty old office blocks that gets turned into atrocious accommodation that doesn't meet any of the requirements for decent housing. And of course, you know, the poorest and the most vulnerable people get thrown into these buildings, and it's an absolute shit show. Student accommodation, we have these things called purpose-built student accommodation, which I call pubes because it just makes me laugh. And again, it's just a total scam. There's so many tax breaks. Like, they don't have to pay business rates because they're for students, but they don't have to pay cap. They basically manage to avoid every single tax, and of course it's all going on through various different tax havens and things. And you go to any English city and go to the center of it, and there's just loads and loads of skyscrapers of student accommodation that are sprouting up, and the architecture is crap, and you know, they're basically just factory farming international students for money, mainly Chinese students, so that they can make as much money as possible. We got loads of empty buildings, and again, there's loads of tax breaks to make sure that if you're land banking and property speculating, you don't have to pay tax. So, you know, some landlords literally like will burn down their building or smash the windows so that they can get tax breaks. So, you know, we have a big problem with arson of empty buildings in this country, and it's mainly done by the landlords to avoid paying tax. Anybody want to come to England? It's fun. Anyway, blah. Sheffield is an amazing city. It's an incredibly green city. It's an incredibly proud working class city. And it was also Britain's first city of sanctuary. We're traditionally incredibly welcoming of people who come here from all over the world and have had many, many waves of migration. I guess the earliest ones were after the Second World War, when people from our colonies were invited to come back here and take jobs because so many people who lived here had been slaughtered. And yeah, so, you know, big wave of Afro-Caribbean migration, Jewish migration in the 70s and 80s, Pakistani and Indian migration. In the last 10, 15 years, we've seen a massive migration of Roma gypsies from Czech and from Slovakia. And in recent years, you know, my local area is chocker with people from Yemen and Kurdistan and all sorts of places. And, you know, our right-wing press, and to be fair, even our pretense of a left-wing opposition party, always like, oh, we need to stop all this, you know, legal migration. It's like, no, they're refugees from war-torn areas that basically are shit shows because of our arms industry and our governments. But yeah, it's very, very, very diverse, and it's also very poor. And when you get very diverse areas with lots of migration and a lot of poverty, you obviously get a lot of social tension, and you get a lot of right-wing fuckers, you know, stoking the flames of racism and ethnic tension. But there is a lot of really good inclusive stuff going on in Sheffield, which is lovely. So I live in most cities in England. The north side and the east side are the poor sides, and the south side and the west side are the wealthy sides. And that's because the wind blows very strongly from west to east in our country, which means the factories were always situated so the smoke didn't blow onto the wealthy people. So I live on the north side, and I live in a really interesting area because I live in an area called Firth Park, and the park was built 150 years ago to try and compensate for the common land that was stolen from people. And when Firth Park was built, it was a very beautiful, purpose-built, landscaped park with a boys stand here, girls stand there, don't drink alcohol and don't talk to each other, but have fun in a very regimented, old-fashioned way. And it got very neglected in the last 30, 40 years. And it's a very, very diverse area. It's also one of the poorest areas of Sheffield. These photos of the park don't do it justice, but it's absolutely beautiful. And also all these photos are empty of people, but it on a sunny day is one of the most beautiful and ethnically diverse picture postcards of how good this country can be that you're likely to see. You know, the playground will be absolutely rammed full of people from all walks of life, speaking all sorts of different languages, and it's very beautiful. So just a few photos of Firth Park. Yeah, so that's the centre of Firth Park. You will notice it's a traffic island that's quite, you know, pretty for a traffic island, but it has 2 tram tracks running through it because there used to be loads of trams in Sheffield, and those tram tracks have been preserved. And I'm just going to sort of end this by sowing a few seeds of a couple of ideas of projects. I would love somebody to like build some badass art sculpture right in the middle of that roundabout, or maybe even if you're feeling ambitious, build a full-scale replica tram. Like, people would go crazy for that shit. Or you're imagining of what some futuristic tram would look like. Should we actually have good public transport in this fuckwit of an island? Because we used to have really good public transport, and now it's pretty bad. Anyway, so yeah, that's a little provocation. And nothing quirky and creative happens in Firth Park. Like, I've lived here for 6 years and started doing things, and it's just like, it just kind of blows people's minds because it only normally happens in the posh parts of town or the hipster parts of town. This is not posh. This is not hipster. No sourdough, no flat whites. There's quite a few of these tree stumps knocking around. Like, the tree surgeons just come along and just lop off the top of the tree and leave these absolutely massive tree stumps. And in other parts of town, they pay a tree sculptor to come and like chainsaw art into them, but that hasn't happened around here. But if anybody fancied like building some crazy art thing on the top of a tree stump, I'd be very happy to help that happen. Yeah, so there you go. As I said, there's lots of links to the various things I've been talking about in the chat. If anybody's got any easy questions, I'm happy to receive them. If anybody's got any difficult questions, I'll try. If anybody's got any observations, heckles, or jokes, and if nobody does, maybe I'll just sing you a song.
Thanks so much, Robin. Yeah, incredible stuff. I'll do a little clap. But yeah, like, thank you so much. That was insane. Who wants to say something? Asha, do you want to go for it?
Yes. Thank you so much for the lecture. It was really great. And also hearing about it from a perspective of somebody that studied in Sheffield in my undergrad was really good. My question is maybe expanding on some themes that I also came across recently, just like reading back about Sheffield and about the situation of the city center, where I've read the footfall has fallen like almost 20% down in the past few years. And with the current, like all the vacancies that are going on there, and just wanted to maybe hear from you from a perspective of somebody also living there, if you could maybe expand on the plans and comment on the plans that the local government is trying to propose in the center, Fargate and the High Street. And yeah, what are your thoughts about it?
Great. Yeah, that's an awesome question. So like most English cities, about 20, 30 years ago, massive out-of-town shopping centres were built. And these shopping centres are very exciting if you want a nice temple to capitalism, but they're absolutely shocking for the impact they have on our city centres. So you combine the out-of-town shopping centres with the lots of people buying online, and it does mean there is a huge amount of empty property in the center of our city at the moment. It looks really derelict and sad and sorry. A lot of it is just owned by property speculators who are just sitting on it because they have no financial incentive really to do much about it. The council has been doing quite a lot of redevelopment in the centre of town, and a lot of money is being spent on it. There's been quite a bit of tension with that because, local groups that might have been able to have a bit more impact were a bit sidelined. And of course, as ever, there are legal obligations to provide affordable and social housing so that poorer people can live there. But there's so many loopholes to get out of it that I imagine by the time things are built, there'll be, gated communities for the wealthy. But, there's a massive, beautiful playground being built. There is a new arts venue opening, and the council is trying to find somebody to run that at the moment. And I really hope there's a coalition of sort of do-it-yourself, quite grassrootsy artists who are hoping to take that on. And if that happened, that would be amazing. But the city centre, it's beautiful. There's a lot of change happening. There's a lot of development happening. Some of it will be for better. Some of it will be for worse. And a little bit of squatting wouldn't be a bad idea. We used to be really good at squatting in this island, but we've got a little bit out of the habit of it at the moment. And the number of empty buildings just sat there when, there are lots of people looking for workspace and lots of people looking for places to have studios and stuff. I was up in Newcastle a little while ago. There's a place called City Bridge where, basically 80 or 90 artists had just created their own studios in this empty building. And, that should just be being done by fair means or foul. Does that answer your question enough, Asha?
Yes, I think so. Yes, thank you so much.
You're welcome. When were you at university here?
2014 to 2017.
Yeah, it's not changed that much, just a few more empty buildings because of the pandemic and the perfect storm of online shopping. We're looking forward to having you back.
Pablo. Right, you're unmuted. You need to unmute yourself.
That is
Yeah,
it
there we
good?
go. Yeah.
Super. Thanks a lot for this amazing presentation. Very funny, very deep as well. So thank you very much for this broader understanding. And I was wondering if on this slideshow with your cards, where you were explaining a bit some of the tricks that are nowadays happening, the one with the Monopoly figure on it, and you were speaking a bit of those means that the speculators and owners are using to avoid paying tax on buildings, and how the law is made to allow maybe a building that has burned or broken window not to have his owner paying tax. And I was wondering if you know a bit more precisely what kind of elements really makes those owners avoid to pay tax. And could it be as simple as, I don't know, for example, having a workshop on which we're thinking of repairing these buildings to push the people to pay tax again as a provocation could also be some interesting things, or if it is really buildings that are completely demolished that are allowing them not to pay tax this way, and so on.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I know that sometimes they get extra tax breaks if the building is in temporary usage. So there are organizations that can sort of go into a building, set things up there temporarily, and they can get a different sort of tax break, which is appealing to them in a different way. So there are things like meanwhile leases, and we do have basically sort of in a way like legalized squatting, where we have property guardian companies who actually charge still fairly decent sums of money for people to come and use empty buildings. I'm not totally up to date with all of the latest legislations at the moment, but would be able to find out. And the idea of trying to make use of some of these empty spaces, empty buildings in town, whether you do that, I've no idea how, if you want to do everything legally, or what degree of naughtiness you're allowed to have and what degree of provocation, you're allowed to have in your projects. But, there might be some owners who would be sympathetic to you guys instigating like a meanwhile project where you take an empty property and throw in lots and lots of you know, sort of studios or workspaces as part of the build, and then they at least are generating some income, and I'm sure can have some wonderful other tax breaks in the process. Identifying those buildings and finding out who owns them is going to be an interesting sport, and you'd probably need to hook up with some activist networks in Sheffield and just kind of see if you could get somebody doing the legwork. Yeah, how's that as an answer, Pablo? Is that okay? Is there anything else?
No, that's great. Thank you very much.
Yeah, I guess it's you only really understand when you like get to Sheffield and sort of look directly at the buildings, and you're like, oh, maybe I can actually get into that one, like to squat, that there's a potential for those sorts of projects. So like we're going to try and like create some sort of list of like places that we think might be potential. But yeah, like it also has to include like finding out who the owner is, trying to understand like if they're likely to be like checking on the site regularly, like because there's some instances where you can be squatting something and then no one like even pays it any mind or notices. Like Robin, you were saying that you've the previous owner of your house like accidentally squatted like some land, like your neighbor's land, and so now that's come into your ownership.
Yeah. What's the point of knowing about land rights if you don't do a little bit of land grabbing yourself? Yeah, I mean, it's still possible to claim squatters' rights on land in this country, and it's something I've been getting good at, which is useful because I don't earn very much money being a musician. Yeah, I mean, I think another thing that's on my mind is that our local newspaper here, called the Sheffield Star, is still fairly well read and is, I think, a daily newspaper, and their business editor is really interested in land rights at the moment and basically keeps on writing all sorts of fabulous articles about it. And it'd be interesting just kind of reaching out to him and saying, hey, are there any interventions that could be done that you'd like to write about? One project I'd really like to do is I want to put on this island, we put up blue plaques if famous people lived in a house or in a particular property. And I'd like to go around putting up plaques to buildings that are owned in tax havens. And I've actually got some people in the council who would be up for coming and unofficially opening them and making a bit of a hoo-ha about it. Because this idea that so much of our island is owned in, on some dodgy building in the Caribbean or something that just has, 1,000 companies in this small room or something. So yeah, there's scope for naughtiness. Sheffield has a history of being very subversive. It has a history of being very anti-establishment, and there's still a good amount of that spirit here. And working out, how much you want to play with that is a fun thing. And obviously, you're all coming from different countries that will have very different laws and very different relationships with land and housing, and just comparing and contrasting the two could be a really interesting, sort of stimulation for you and also for us. Because a lot of people in this island don't realize how much better land rights and property rights are in other countries in Europe that we think of as being quite similar to us. So yeah, be provocative, please.
Oh, definitely. Yeah, and yeah, we're like, as a organizing team, we're open to hearing your ideas about that and trying to make them happen. Yeah, within the framework, but without like getting anyone in too much trouble, because you're allowed to do that legally. So yeah, and as well, it's really interesting to hear you talk about like overseas developers, like particularly in relation to a lot of the towers that I see going up in London, that are like saying that they're building housing to sort of resolve issues of like lack of housing in the UK, but all of the housing in like sort of first round, there's this huge development in Elephant and Castle in South London, and all the sort of first round of buyers for that, all people overseas buying them as investment properties. And so like by building houses, you're actually not solving the issue of the housing crisis, you're just sort of exacerbating it and increasing the value of any house around. Makes it really hard for anyone else to sort of get on that property ladder, as it were.
Absolutely. And the artificial scarcity as well. I mean, there's this myth that like we're an overcrowded island. We have a very small amount of built environment compared to many other countries. And this idea that like, oh, we mustn't, build any new houses because that'll mean the island will be overrun. And, it's like, no, we don't have a housing crisis. We have a distribution of land crisis in this country. And it's still owned by mostly the same old aristocratic families. But they don't want you to find that out. And as a result of that, they've created such a perfect lack of transparency and secrecy about ownership that it does mean that now, the international super rich and the dodgy criminals of the world just want to hide their money in this island. And community good is a long, long way away from what they're interested in.
If anyone else has anything to say, then please do raise your hand.
I'm good at times tables as well, if anybody's got a tricky one.
Just different general knowledge stuff. Do you I think it's a really good point as well, when you're sort of bringing it from the land around Sheffield to the city centre and the suburbs. Sheffield's quite a small city, and it's really easy to get right out into the countryside. You can sort of get the bus and be out there in 15 minutes in the Peak District. So there is scope within our event framework to have projects in different types of setting. So it can be about actual land, grass, or farmland as we imagine land, and then the sort of inhabiting buildings in the city centre.
There's a good and strong community food growing sort of sector in Sheffield, and they've there's a Quaker businessman who's fairly ideologically minded, and he's been letting them have some of his farmland just south of Sheffield. And might want to go and build some badass structure down there that they can use as a packing station or something. I don't know, whatever food growers do. Actually, I should know, I was a food grower. So yeah, sheds, basically. They need sheds for drying seeds. Sorry.
Yeah, what do you think about in general? So we're coming in as a sort of group of young people gonna do lots of art and I don't know, interventions, social projects, whatever, all in Sheffield. How do you think that relates to what you're saying gentrification is a bad thing, and the things that are happening in Callum Island, to what what do you feel about the the idea of making a place better through culture, and then is that just going to mean that people are going to have to move on from Atcliffe in 15 years time or something when it gets nice again?
Yeah, I mean it's I used to live in Hackney in East London in the shadow of the Olympics, so I've had front row seats for one of the most intense gentrification projects in this island's history. And basically, there are always winners and there are always losers. In Kelham Island, there used to be the most amazing circus space where people from all over Sheffield, all over England and all over Europe came and did circus stuff. And, they'd been evicted, and that's now going to be a trendy bar very soon. And I'm sure these stories play out in very many different ways, whether you're in Portugal or Germany or, other parts where artistic people congregate, make use of lesser used spaces, and then get cleared out once it becomes profitable. And I think it's important to have, transient spaces of creativity and creative communities. I think it's also good if those communities are aware of the roles they're playing in essentially those areas being cleansed of places where poor people can be, and at the same time as being creative, they're also doing that creativity with a political consciousness and an awareness of how laws could and should be changed, so that when gentrification happens, it's not people with less money who are cleared out of those spaces, and those spaces are designed for people from all social economic groups. Whew, how was that for an answer?
I think that was a great answer.
Thank you.
I guess that's the whole point of this, is to try and understand what we do as producers of architecture, in the context of this like wider system.
Yeah.
Trying
I mean,
to answer that.
if you're looking for answers, as I say, I put an enormous amount of work into a policy paper called Land for the Many, which was written with another 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. It was basically written with 6 of the smartest people I've ever met in my entire life. And we spent a year working on this voluntarily. And basically, like, if we went into government tomorrow, how would we change the laws in order to make land rights more equitable in this country? And it's not perfect, and we were having to work with political constraints. That meant that we couldn't be as radical as we perhaps would have liked to be. But if you want a sort of, you know, a nitty gritty sort of nuts and bolts, like what policy shifts would be necessary in order to have a more just society, yeah, it's quite readable. Well, there's some chapters that are readable, there's some chapters that really aren't, depending on how academic the author was.
Right. But yours are really readable, is that what you're saying?
Well, it's not marked who's written by who, so luckily I can just say something broad like that, and then you can just enjoy it. But yeah, you know, if you're interested to understand more, the other thing that's worth giving a shout out to is the EU did an access to land project a few years ago, and I contributed quite a bit to that. And they wrote a really interesting publication that compared and contrasted land rights all over Europe. And it totally blew my mind, because there's some countries that have the opposite problem. Rather than having too great a concentration of land in the hands of too few people, they have too much dispersed ownership. So you get like one tiny patch of land and 30 people own it and they can't agree what to do with it. So it's yeah, just really interesting seeing how differently things are in different places. And yeah, so that's a good place if you want to get geeky at a sort of an EU level and compare and contrast.
Amazing. Thanks so much. That was really great.
You're welcome.
So
Now you just need to go and find some budget so that I can perform my 3 acres and a cow show for all of your
definitely.
rabble.
After that, I'm sure people are like, please, we want to hear more.
Cool. I'm like this in real life, just with added ukulele. You can see.
Yeah, I see all of the instruments.
There you go.
Oh, lovely stuff.
Oh yeah, right, cool. Well, I'm going to go and do some very geeky online board game playing with my friends. I hope you guys have a lovely rest of Zoom call. I look forward to seeing you in February or March or May or whatever. And you've got my contact details on the 3 Acres and a Cow website. Don't be a stranger if you want to send me any feedback.
Cool, amazing. Thanks so much.
Bye.
Bye. Okay. So we are.